Chapter 5, Sac de Billes. So at the end of chapter 4, we'd left our two boys buying their tickets to Aguedmont, so they were wandering around Dax. This chapter, chapter 5, deals with the day that they spend in Aguedmont and how they cross the line. There's also a little bit of a story once they get across the line about people that they meet there. So just an overview of this chapter, what happens. The boys arrive in Aguedmont, which is where they've established the border crossing is, or the ligne de demarcation, not an official border crossing. And they find a passeur to help them cross the border. This is Raymond. They strike a deal with him because actually when they first approach him and he says, I know what you're here for, you want to ask me about how to cross the demarcation line. He tells them that other passeurs are charging a fortune, but he will do it for 5,000 francs. However, in order to do that, they have to spend the day helping him out with his deliveries. So the boys do that. They spend quite a nice day, quite a carefree day wandering around Aguedmont. And then at night, they meet up with Raymond and they pay him 5,000 francs to cross the ligne de demarcation. It's quite tense, but it's nothing like what Joe thought it would be. He thought it would actually be a real border with soldiers. They can hear noise in the distance, they can hear other people passing, but there is no physical line, and that takes Joe by surprise. They cross over at night time and they sleep in a barn. Joe wakes up at one point and he realizes that Maurice isn't there. It turns out that Maurice has memorized the route. He's realized that they're going to run out of money, so he's gone back across the ligne de demarcation and he's charging people 500 francs each to cross the border, so much cheaper than the other passeur. The next morning, the boys wake up, they go to see the local farmer who sends them on their way with a little bit of food. He also tells them a story about his experiences as a child, and it seems like that might come across as a bit of a warning. Be careful of the Germans. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail. Then the next stage of the boys' journey is that they have to walk to Air-sur-l'Adour, which is about 25-30 kilometres away. It's quite a long walk. Obviously, Maurice hasn't slept much because he's been helping people to pass. And after a while, Maurice says he's really tired and he wants to have a nap. Joe is pleased because he's been getting these terrible blisters on his feet, but he's been determined to keep walking. Whilst Maurice is having his nap, he hears something coming from the distance, and it's a guy in a horse and cart. This is the man that is known in the novel as the Comte de Billes, and he agrees to take them all the way to Air-sur-l'Adour. He's a bit of an odd character. The boys have to listen to his musings on the way, but eventually he takes them to the station, and that's where we leave the boys at the end of chapter 5. So just a few things about some of the things that I've mentioned. The Comte de Billes, who I just made reference to, he speaks at the boys for most of their journey. He's a very old-fashioned character. He comes across as a lover of the way things used to be, old France. He's a monarchist. But he's also perhaps typical of this type of person who used to have money, people that have titles but perhaps not the money and the power to go with that anymore. At the bottom of page 122, he's telling the boys France was only great in the time of the kings, that we've never known such a catastrophe whilst we had a monarchy. But he also goes on to say, jamais un roi n'eut accepté de voir son peuple colonisé de l'intérieur par toutes sortes d'éléments étrangers, de sectes, de races, qui n'ont eu de cesse que d'amener la nation au bord de l'abîme. So he refers to races and sects who have led the nation to the brink of disaster. We assume from that he's talking about foreign influences, foreign Jews, perhaps foreign communists, but he definitely wouldn't have helped the boys if he knew who they really were. I also talked about the farmers' warning. So he's a very nice man. He's another example of people who go out of their way to help the boys. He's offered all of the people that crossed that night his barn to sleep in, and the boys go to see him the next morning. He gives them a bit of food, and he says to them, we're looking at page 114 now, un peu attendri. He tells them this story of when he used to go to school when he was little, and how he used to read this book called Le Tour de France de deux enfants. And he says, you look a little bit like the boys in that story. And Maurice asks, qu'est-ce qui leur arrive? What happened to them? And he says, oh, well, I don't really remember. They had all kinds of adventures, but it all ended up well. But then he says, mais il n'y avait pas d'Allemand dans l'histoire. It's almost like he's giving the boys a warning. He knows that they are trying to avoid the Germans. He probably knows they're Jewish. And he said, you know, I've read this story about these boys and they had a great time, but be careful because there weren't any Germans in this story. In other words, he's telling them that they need to look out for the Germans. Okay, so that's the main things that happen in this chapter. The themes, well, one of the main themes throughout the book is la guerre. We see, as the boys arrived in Agedmo, on page 83, everything is absolutely deserted. They don't understand where everybody is. But as soon as they enter into the cafe, it's heaving. So what they see in front of them are people who are dressed like they're from the towns, the cities, families. Definitely not what we call les paysans, country dwellers. Definitely not the kind of people that would traditionally live in this village. So perhaps what we are seeing are lots and lots of people waiting to pass over the ligne de demarcation. We can also see how some people have benefited from the war. So on page 86, Maurice has engaged one of the waitresses in conversation. And she says, oh, we've been busy for 6 months and more. Croyez-moi, le jour où les Frisés ont placé cette ligne à 1 kilomètre d'ici, ils ont contribué à enrichir pas mal. So what she's saying to them is the day that the Germans decided to put the demarcation line so close to this village, they made us lots of money. So we can see that the inhabitants of this town, particularly the cafe owner, are benefiting from the war. So this is a flip side to the war. Some people are benefiting from it. The waitress also adds that the owner could spend her life in the hairdressers because she's making that much money. The other person who's benefiting from this that we meet is Raymond. He is undercutting the other passeur by a lot, but he's still making a lot of money from it. The other passeurs are charging a lot more. So we can see that people who lived around these areas were really profiting and benefiting. On a more negative side, which is what we're used to associating with the war, we see evidence of rationing. The boys are in the cafe, they're offered lentils, they're offered radishes, not particularly great radishes. There's also another negative war reference on page 98. The boys are crossing in the darkness and the woods are filled with other people passing. So we've got this section on page 98 where Joe says, il y a quelqu'un sur la gauche, there's somebody on the left. And Raymond says, je sais, une douzaine, c'est le vieux Branché qui les fait passer. So it's old man Branché who's passing other people. So they're surrounded by other people. And there's a real sense of danger in these woods. They're crossing in the darkness. They can hear the German patrols in the distance, les patrouilles. Joe is paranoid. He thinks they're making a huge amount of noise. He says, Hitler lui-même devait nous entendre dans son appartement berlinois. Hitler himself must have been able to have heard us in his Berlin apartment. So there's quite a tense atmosphere. And then even when they think they are safe on the other side, on page 112, Maurice says that he was talking to somebody who he helped cross over that night. But he says, il faut faire attention parce qu'il y a des flics un peu partout et qu'ils ont ordre d'arrêter les Juifs. So Maurice tells Joe, I was talking to this man and he's told me that there are police everywhere and that they're under orders to arrest Jews. Now this comes as a real big shock, particularly to Joe, because the boys have believed that as soon as they get to La Zone Libre, they'll be safe. What he doesn't know is that actually Vichy France had a very similar anti-Jewish policy. And bit by bit, the people living in Free France were starting to comply with those rules. And Joe's response, perhaps his response from an adult viewpoint, is pourquoi avons-nous fait ce trajet si c'est pour retourner dans le même enfer? So why have we made all of this journey if it's to go back into the same hell? So there's this constant fear of being caught. One other reference to the war in this chapter is the Comte de V himself. He's driving a very old-fashioned calèche, a horse and carriage, and he tells Joe that the reason that he's driving this is because his car's been requisitioned by the Germans. About halfway through that main paragraph, he says, Je possédais une automobile il y a encore moins de 6 mois, mais elle me fut réquisitionnée pour servir sans doute à quelques officiers en zone occupée. So he's had to give up his car, no doubt, to go off and help the German cause. So he's reduced to using his old horse and carriage. Identity is another theme in this chapter. The boys get the impression that they are surrounded by des fuyards, other people who are fleeing, and there's no doubt that many of them will be Jewish. There is an episode during the day that they're helping Raymond with his deliveries on page 92, where they hear a whistle and somebody emerges from the trees. And he says, Vous êtes du pays? Are you local? And then when the boys say no, he says, Vous êtes juif? Are you Jewish? They very clearly say no. Remember, they've been told to always deny their identity. But this person asking the question says, Moi, si j'ai ma femme et ma belle-mère dans le bois, je cherche à passer. So I've got my wife and my mother-in-law in the wood, and I'm looking to pass over. So we've got this episode here where we've got somebody telling the boys I'm Jewish, but they deny it. And then later on, when they're lying in the barn in the middle of the night, Joe hears somebody make an exclamation in Yiddish. So there is this strong sense of being surrounded by Jewish people. The boys are definitely denying their identity. Other people are choosing to admit it or not, depending on what point they're at. The relationship between Joe and Maurice is another important theme in this chapter. Mostly Maurice takes the lead in the adventure in this chapter. It's he who addresses the waitress in the cafe, and it's he who approaches Raymond. Most importantly, Maurice realises that they need more money, and he is devious enough to remember the route and go back and take money off people to help earn more money. A word that we might use quite a lot about Maurice is sournois, devious. However, we also see Joe start to toughen up in this chapter. He has this ampoule, a big blister on his ankle, and it's really causing him quite a lot of pain, but he's determined not to let Maurice see that it's bothering him as they're making that long walk to Air-sur-l'Adour. Contrast this with Joe of chapter 1, who cried very easily when his marble was taken from him. So we see Joe start to toughen up. Durcir is the verb to toughen up. Alors, on peut dire que Joe commence à durcir. And it's also he who, on page 116, here's the calèche approaching, and it's he who, it's Joe that speaks to the Comte de Ville and agrees that he will help take them to Air-sur-l'Adour. That's it really for the themes in this chapter. Just one other thing to think about is Joe's imagination, and this probably ties to the theme of childhood. On page 97, I've mentioned he imagines that he's being very, very noisy. But interestingly, he's bigged up in his head this idea about the demarcation line. He imagines it'll be a real physical wall or a physical line. He thinks they're going to be playing like cowboys and Indians crossing. In fact, at one point, Raymond turns around to him saying, you know, we're not playing, you don't need to play the Sioux, S-I-O-U-X, a type of Indian. So Joe's actually quite disappointed. And this ties into Joe's imagination, which links to the theme of childhood. So at the end of this chapter, the boys have arrived at the train station at Air-sur-l'Adour, and they are ready to get on the next step of their journey, which is the journey to Marseille.